Welcome into my second YouTube live. Scott Burnstein, OG Pod. These are kind of fun. People have been telling me that I should have been doing these 10 years ago. So I'm always late to the party. I was late to get on YouTube. I'm slow on the update sometimes. So, but this was a lot of fun. We did one earlier this week. We're going to start rolling these things out pretty regularly. And at some point, we'll kind of be jumping back and forth between Patreon and YouTube. But as I said, as we're going to be launching the Patreon, we are not leaving the YouTube. There's still going to be a lot of content on YouTube for free. The same kind of content you've been getting. We're just going to be putting a little bit more exclusivity up on Patreon. Just as an example, you might get a 45-minute interview on YouTube, but if you go to the Patreon, you might get the same interview, but it's an hour, 20 minutes. It's uncut, like director's cut, stuff like that. But I just want to start off by, and I'll start, fielding questions, and we can chop it up, and a lot going on. I'm lucky that, business is good in the world of organized crime because there's so much activity in terms of court cases and bar fights and territorial wars between bikers and mafia dons up in Canada. So, but I just wanted to address one thing from one of the. He's a viewer, and I don't know what your name is, but I'm sure you would acknowledge you're a bit of a troll. You like coming after me for my Canadian reporting, and I just wanted to. You made a comment about the last episode where I talked about Blood Family Mafia and somebody getting apprehended and put to prison, put into jail and getting beat up. There were actually two separate situations in the last month where Blood Family Mafia members out of Quebec City were arrested, locked up, and then tuned up. So you weren't wrong, and I wasn't wrong. You thought that I was talking about the more recent one, where a guy has been outed as a cooperator, and I don't know what his name is, but he went into a lockup, and the guys that are affiliated to the Blood Family Mafia there, beat him up pretty bad. I was referring to one of Ice Pick Turmel's main lieutenants at a much bigger level than the guy you were talking about. And I don't want to. His last name is Bernier. He got picked up in British Columbia. You said he didn't, but he did. Because again, I think you were thinking I was talking about this other situation. But Bernier, who was a top lieutenant of Ice Pick Turmel, was on the run, got picked up in British Columbia. And then when he went to go see the judge for his first court hearing after he got locked up, he had been physically assaulted pretty bad. So just wanted to touch on that, and we can jump in and start taking some questions. And what up, Joey Godfrey? Thanks for joining us. I know it's Friday. Hey, guys, I know it's Friday night. I was kind of thinking about maybe, Friday night. I don't know if a lot of people, Juan Ma 4707 is jumping in. I don't want to disrupt people from, going out and enjoying the weekend. I'm, it's kind of past my prime in that regard. I used to, Friday and Saturdays, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Hey, Tony from Montreal. I was... I wasn't here. I wasn't in front of my computer. I was definitely going out and about in the town in my 20s and 30s, or maybe by the end of start of my 30s, I started to wind down. But now I'm in my 40s, so I'm here on Friday nights. Can there be a sliver of truth that this is coming from Xavier James, that Hoffa is on the third baseline? I think he's referring to the case, the story that came out about a year ago from a pretty famous documentarian, and there was a police officer, a dirty cop, that died a long time ago. And when he died, he on his deathbed gave a like an ace of spades, I think it was, like a playing card, and he put some type of message that Jimmy Hoffa had been buried beneath Milwaukee County Stadium, that he actually had been moved, I think, from somewhere to the stadium, and then I have it written up, and I did a quick hitter about it. I'm not. It was tied to Joey Aiuppa in Chicago, and this guy was like from Milwaukee, and then he moved to Chicago, and it was like a cop that was also like working as like a bodyguard for Aiuppa and some other guys. I'd have to refresh myself with the whole story. I don't put any weight on it. I don't put any weight to it. No, I don't think he's buried in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, underneath what used to be County Stadium. I don't think they would have ever moved him. I don't think even someone like Joey Aiuppa would have had details of what happened. I think very few people had the specifics, and those people all took it to the grave. And I'm 99.9% sure all those people were from Detroit. So I think we get lost in the weeds a little bit with the Hoffa stuff. Thank you. How come Blackjack Toko isn't talking about? We ever do a piece on him? I think we did. No, we didn't. I was thinking that we recorded something, but we started to record something, and I don't believe we ever finished it. So at one point, me and JB are going to do a deep dive into a story that I wrote about a month or two ago, maybe 3 months ago. I got my hands on some Jack Toko FBI files. I get some every year. He's been dead for about 11 years, I think. 11 years. No, 10 years. 10 years. 10 years last month. And every year my Freedom of Information Act request will get me a new box of documents. And I got my hands on some surveillance logs from 1986, I think, or 1985, 1986. And I wrote a story called A Week in the Life of Jack Toko. I believe it was the winter of 86. And I just kind of took you through what he did every day. And it was, for nerds and for, kind of inside baseball stuff. It was cool. And this was a guy that wasn't a John Gotti type. He was not a guy that was going, we're talking about weekends, was not going out club hopping. He was at home every night by 11 o'clock in bed with his, going to sleep with his wife, and, a very hardcore family man, in addition to being a hardcore LCN, but he wasn't a known partier. So yeah, we're going to do some more Jack Toko stuff. Why hasn't he gotten more run? I just think Detroit doesn't get a lot of run. Even in what we do here with OG Pod, what I do with Gangster Report, I wish I could do more Detroit stuff. It doesn't really move the needle, even in Detroit. So, what's the current, Will Clay, what's the current standing for Detroit LCM with the 5 families and the other families? These guys, Tony LaPiana, are alleged underboss, even though he's 82. He knows everybody across the country. He knows all the major bosses. And Jackie Giacalone, who's the alleged boss, 74 years old right now. He grew up with Billy and Tony Jack. He met everybody. These are two guys that know a lot of other OC figures around the country, just through their LCN activity, as well as their mentors. And Jackie's mentor was his dad, Billy Jack, who was beloved by everybody, not just in Detroit, but around the country. Again, we talk about that trifecta of organized crime legends: loved, feared, respected. It's easy to get 2 of those 3, but not as easy to get all 3. And Billy Jack definitely checked all those boxes. And with Tony Lop, he checks those boxes. Jack Toko was his mentor. It was his uncle via marriage. His mentor was Jack Toko, as well as his father-in-law. Vince Maley, as well as some guys back in Chicago. I actually recently shout out to Black Hand Forum, great research on there, and Tony, my guy Tony from Chicago, was able to not Chicago Tony, but my friend, my fellow researcher Tony, who lives in Chicago, found case documents on Chicago Tony LaPiana's one run-in with the feds. I have the mugshot. It's something that I've published online in my books from 1967, before Chicago Tony moved to Detroit in the early 70s. But I knew it was a hijacking case, but based on Tony's research, he got some specifics on it, and it was a truck full of cigar boxes, and that's what Lop hijacked. Well, allegedly, because he ended up beating the case, was arrested for. And he was doing this with a group that was tied to, again, some pretty heavy hitters. Back then, he was only in his early 20s. I think he was 23 or 24 when he took that pinch, but he was Fifi Bucheri and Willie Potatoes Dodano were guys that were involved in this hijacking ring. I know that Chicago Tony also grew up amongst the Wild Bunch. His best friend growing up was little Tony Borsellino. So still a lot of contacts between the guys in Detroit. And then PT, Pete Toko, who died a couple months ago, his wife's family was from out in Chicago. And he's somebody that used to go around the country on behalf of Jack Toko and some other guys, and everybody knew PT. So it's a family that still exists. They thrive in the shadows, and they still have connections to other crime families. They're just, not what they used to be, but they're not gone. I saw someone said about, I know quite a bit about the Biggie and Tupac stuff. Do I think the LAPD corruption played a role in Biggie's murder? Yeah. The more we seem to learn about the skeletons in Puffy's closet, it looks like something that I really dismissed 15 years ago or 10, 15 years ago when it was first reported that Puffy was behind this in some way. I pushed back on that. And now I was wrong. I think that Puffy was behind this. And I think Puffy will possibly end up seeing charges for this, in addition to the sex trafficking and God knows what else is coming down the line. But Puffy Combs is going to end up being the Harvey Weinstein of hip hop. I have no doubt in my mind. He's going to die in prison. It's just when he ends up not being a free man anymore. It could be next week, could be next month, could be in a year or two, but his time's running short, in my opinion. And you could tell me, and I could potentially believe that he had something to do with killing Biggie too. It's interesting because I think me and other people were of the opinion pretty early on. I know I was. I grew up, a huge hip hop fan, and I was 19 years old when Biggie and Pac both died, and it was always something I've been interested in and studied. And a lot of people believe that Suge was behind both of them, but in reality, because Suge was more, at least the way he presented, was more of a gangster than Puff. But at the end of the day, I actually think it's a much better chance, and probably, at least in terms of Pac, this came from Puff. And I do believe that, LAPD corruption was involved in it. Federal corruption was involved in it, in my opinion. I think there was I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, and I know this is a hot button topic or hot button term, so I use it semi loosely, but I think there was some systemic racism there. I'm not someone that goes down those lines often, because I think it's something that, shouldn't be overused. You should never overuse the race card. It should only be used when it needs to be used, when it's true. But I just don't think that if Pac and Big had been the two biggest rock stars in the world at that time, or the two biggest actors in the world at that time, and they had been white. I don't think we'd be sitting here 30 years later still having these conversations. I think there would have been a public mandate almost that we get to the bottom of it. And because they were viewed as kind of gangbanging rappers, I think it got marginalized and people were like, just gangbangers killing other gangbangers. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of Puff and Big and all that stuff. So do a special on the Hitman Exchange Program at BC. I'm not really sure what that is. AH. I don't claim to be a criminal expert on the western side of Canada. I'm barely an expert on what's going on in Quebec and Ontario. I'm just starting kind of to build an expertise there. But I don't really know about any type of activity, whether it be LCN or not LCN, let's be the wrong word. Whether it be Italian organized crime or bikers or street gangs. I don't really know about anything that's going on in Vancouver or Alberta, British Columbia, Calgary, those places. Do I think Vic Orino was framed? I know there's some decent evidence that brings questions related to how that case all went down. And I'm not somebody that in any way, shape, or form supports what I think is in some ways this like unspoken truth in federal law enforcement, or in in local law enforcement too. But when they're going after the big guns on the street, literally and figuratively, there's this accepted unspoken rule of means justify, or ends justify means. And I don't agree with that at all. Orina is pushing 90 now. I think he doesn't know where he is. The word is that he walks around the medical facility, the federal medical facility around Boston, thinking that he's the warden of a prison that he's not in. Or it's sad. I don't really know what the point of keeping him locked up right now is. I understand Vic Amuso, the boss of the Lucchese's. I understand he's 89, and from people I talk to, both on the street and in law enforcement, federal prosecutors, they still think he's got a pretty big role in, as much as he can, controlling Lucchese affairs to a degree. Vic Orina hasn't had any shot calling authority in the Columbos since Bill Clinton was president. So I question sometimes that kind of stuff. I'm not trying to, I'm not diminishing the victims over his career. He was involved in murders. I have no doubt about that. But I don't really see a reason to keep him locked up right now. Live across the window. Can you tell us about mob connections to Windsor? Well, Detroit. This is Mouth of the South. Someone that lives in Windsor, which is hop, skip, and a jump from Detroit. You can sit on the river edge of Detroit and almost spit on Windsor, and vice versa. Our skylines kind of mirror each other or butt each other. I love Windsor. I said it on the last live. I've spent a lot of time there in my life. Great Little Italy on Erie Street. A lot of OC activity, a lot of biker activity. They're kind of this area that gets lost a little bit in coverage zones because it's Canadian. They're a Canadian city, but they're so close to Detroit. It's not like I kind of thought Buffalo and Hamilton were, but they're like, I think, half hour, 45 minutes from each other. But with Windsor and Detroit, it's practically the same city. I mean, just separated by a river. in a bridge in a tunnel. The Detroit mob has always had a flag planted in Windsor dating back to Prohibition. The Catalanatis, the Ciccinis, Minato, no Minato, Tony Powell, the former consigliere, downriver capo, FBI. FBI believes he was the triggerman in the Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa murder. Tony Powell always had a lot of stuff going on in Canada, in Windsor. In fact, his last prison sentence that he did in the 90s was tied to something he had going on in Ontario, a joint task force bust between the FBI, DEA, and RCMP. So I don't really have names or particular rackets, what's going on in Windsor, but I doubt that Detroit is removed from it. I'm sure they still have a piece. It might be a smaller piece than they used to. Tony Powell only died 5 years ago, so that wasn't that long ago. Again, when you've had an operation going somewhere for decades and decades and decades, it's people are way too quick, I think, in the analysis of modern day OC to look at those things and just dismiss them because there's not coverage or there's not cases in some situations. That just because you don't see it or hear about it, it's not there. When these are, again, operations to a degree that have been going on for 100 years, it'd be difficult to just make it go away. It's not easy to just close the door on something like that. And why? And I guess why would you? If it's been around for 100 years, there's probably a reason. It's probably benefiting you. So anything I find out, I would always report. But as I said before, the Detroit stuff just doesn't get people excited like I wish it would. And they're not a very exciting family. If you're someone who likes to analyze and really enjoy like understanding minutia or organizational tradecraft, stuff like that, they're great. But there's not a lot of fireworks. Brought Kim Bowen on the show. She knows her shit. Yeah, we should. But why is there no good documentary about Joe the Animal? It's a good question. Joe the Animal Barboza, Portuguese, I believe, worked for Old Man Patriarcha, went off the reservation, cooperated, was in witness protection, living in, I think, San Francisco, maybe Los Angeles, somewhere out in California. And you had a hit team from Boston that located him and went out there and killed him. One of those guys is actually still alive today and said to be, at the forefront of leadership, the Patriarcha crime family. That's Spucky Spagnuolo. He allegedly was the driver. And he was driving for the alleged triggerman, J.R. Russo, who was one of Spucky's mentors. J.R. has been gone for 20 plus years, 25 years. Died in prison. But those were East Boston guys. And Boston's fascinating. The whole Boston Providence. I don't think there's been enough stuff done. I mean, even from a movie perspective, Affleck did some, did The Town, which was awesome. And Friends of Eddie Coyle is just maybe most underrated gangster flick ever. But just like Detroit and other kind of areas of the country that aren't New York or LA or Chicago, they get kind of ignored. But I agree that something about Joe Barboza would be great. My dream project, or one of my dream projects, is getting the whole Cadillac Frank story out. Benny can hit the siren here. I've talked about it before on OG Pod that for a very, very short period of time, I had an autobiography project going with Cadillac Frank a year maybe before he got pulled out of witness protection and charged with the Stevie DeSaro murder. Eventually died in prison a couple years ago. And I think that's a story that has never really been told to the level that it needs to be told. And there's a lot of Whitey Bulger in there that is like for a story that for the Whitey Bulger thing, which has just been told ad nauseum. I mean, there's been so many people that have told the Whitey Bulger story. The Salemi slice of that just seems to get lost. I mean, Bulger was almost in some ways singularly responsible for Salemi's rise to power, not directly, indirectly. He got rid of guys that he didn't like by feeding information to the government, and in return, he was able, for most of the 1990s or the first half of the 1990s when they were both on the street. Well, Bulger and the Irish guys in the Winter Hill Gang were able to install, kind of almost via proxy, Salemi as the Italian mafia boss, and they could work with him. They didn't work very well with the Italians before that. They had a working relationship, but it wasn't incredibly strong. And then they were able to kind of manipulate factors on their end to, in some ways, lay the groundwork for Salemi to get in there. And then Salemi killed a lot of people that the FBI, let him basically get away with murder. I mean, if it wasn't for Stevie DeSaro's body being dug up on a tip, the FBI didn't care about putting those murders to bed. And I say this with all due respect for FBI agents who I know a lot of these guys, and a lot of them are guys that have helped me a lot, and I personally have great affinity for them. But I'm not going to shy away from talking about, in general, the way sometimes I view the operation. And in terms of Salemi, you had a guy that they were so desperate to nail Conley and then find Bulger and make up for that shit show that they're of their own making, by the way, that they literally allowed Salemi, Cadillac Frank, to acknowledge the murders that he committed as a kid. Coming up in the 60s, he admitted to 8 or 9 hits in the Irish mob wars of the 60s and early 70s. But he was never forced to take accountability for dozen, probably at least, over a half dozen gangland slayings that he was personally responsible for in terms of either ordering or carrying out or having his son carry out between 1990 and 1995, 96. And the FBI knew that he did it. They knew that he was involved in all these hits that, in theory, they would want to put to bed. You have victims' families. You want to get closure. But he wouldn't acknowledge them. He wanted to protect people, whether it be Bobby DeLuca or wanted to protect the memory of Frankie Boy. I don't really understand it totally. When you get a deal with the feds, you're supposed to, it's like going to the priest. You admit all your sins and they're all washed away, but you got to admit all your sins. And the FBI knew that he was not being forthright, and they still cut the deal with him, and they still let him out, and they knew that it was more than just Stevie DeSaro. So I think that all needs to come out, and I'm eager to tell that story. Whether the Barbosa story eventually comes out, I don't know. I think there's more avenues for content now than there's ever been. There will continue to be more streaming opportunities, and just there's so much development now. I think if there's a great story, it will eventually be told. Liam, is Philly LCN headed for a war, or is that just not possible? I don't really think that there are, outside of what we see in Canada, which is a different animal. I don't predict or see potential with mob wars in American cities. We flirted with a couple, when I'm talking about in the modern era. I know some of my reporting has come under, I guess you could say, scrutiny about what I was reporting in the Bananos last year in 2022 and 2023. I stand by it. I know it happened. I know that it will eventually make its way into court filings. But there was a situation between Mikey Mancuso and his Bronx guys against kind of a pseudo insurgents that was coming from Brooklyn, and we know some of it is public record. We know that there was a vote to try to get Mancuso out that was taken by the Brooklyn faction led by Joe C. We know that he won the vote. We know that the vote wasn't certified, to use a term from our political parlance in Washington, D.C. And we know that when Mancuso was coming out of prison, he shelved all of Camerano's guys. We know that in the summer of 22, there was a brawl at a funeral home because Mikey Mancuso wouldn't allow Joe Camerano to come to his father-in-law's wake, and some top guys in the Bananos were assaulted. And I reported, and I stand by the reporting, that there were a series of shootings and fire bombings that lasted from December of 22 through part of 23. Things have now been quelled, and everybody is back playing nice. And I reported that Bruno Indelicato came into the consigliere spot at some point this year, and that was kind of an olive branch to the other side, and things have really stabilized. And we give credit to Mikey Mancuso, who did a great job from just not being here. People thought, because he had to go to prison for a year, a lot of people were predicting things would get worse. They got better. Johnny Joe and Ernie, they proved their merit in terms of mob leadership. I want to address. So I'm sorry, I'm digressing away from Philly, but then I want to go back to something with the Bananas. So here's what I'll say, and I think I know more will come out this month. I will put something out this month that adds some significant clarity to some of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes at from that fight last week at Chicky and Pete's. There are, and I said this, I believe, on my video updates. I might have said this on the previous live. There's more than one circumstance at play at what happened at Chicky and Pete's. It's not in a vacuum. There's a lot of people that are trying to spin a narrative that a bar fight is just a bar fight, and this happens all the time, and then what's the big deal? Kind of like what people were trying to say about the arson at Skinny Joey Merlino's cheesesteak spot back in May. And if we were just discussing the fight between, when the Ciancaglini showed up and this group of guys were being allegedly disrespectful to the Ciancaglini's nieces, and it resulted in physical altercation that then mushroomed into a parking lot brawl. If we were just talking about just that one situation in a vacuum, you'd be right. It probably has, or it didn't really have anything to do with the mob. That's true. But the situations that preceded it did. There is quite a bit of chaos going on behind the scenes that people don't know about. That's not public yet. And it's not a chaos that's at this point spread across the whole crime family, but there is a slice of the Bruno Scarfo organization now where there is some dust ups happening. and the dust-ups are happening amongst lower-level guys. It hasn't reached until Johnny Chang was involved in this fight at Chicky and Pete's. It hadn't really reached any of the top guys, but underneath the surface, there are lower-level guys that are getting into brawls, fights, shootouts, and then there was a break-in at a major player's South Philly residence where money and jewelry was taken. We're not going to, right now, we're not going to get into who that was, but I'll just say it's somebody of significance. And we don't know what that's about. We don't know if what's connected to what. Maybe nothing's connected, but people wouldn't be doing their job as an investigator, whether you're a journalist or a police officer or a Fed, if you weren't looking into it, because all these dots might not be connected, but since May, there have been a bunch of little dots in this little orbit, with some of the same players being involved in different situations. None of those players are the guy that I'm saying that, or I know, got their house broken into. That person is separate right now from everything else. But there are people, including the federal government, that are seeing if they can find a line between all this other stuff and the break into this guy's house. So I don't think there'll be a war, but things don't seem to be settling down after the arson in May. They seem to be ramping up. And I have no idea. Again, I want to be very clear. I know that Mr. Merlino and some of his acolytes and surrogates have been out there trying to say that I'm trying to tie the Merlino podcast into the brawl last weekend at Chicky and Pete's, and I'm not at all. I don't think there's any connection. So anyone that's saying that I think there's a connection or reported there's a connection, that's false. I brought it out there to contextualize the kind of surreal year that has been going on in the Philadelphia mob, with all these incidences that are just, some of them are weird, some of them are not weird, but they raise questions. It's just not everything's copacetic. And again, you can read into it however you want, but that's a fact. But I'm by no means am I saying there's anything to do with the podcast or the arson with what happened at the fight. I'm not. I'm simply saying there's been a lot of activity. So I want to be clear on that. But I don't think we're headed towards a war or anything. But I do think things need to be, there needs to be some type of closure to what's going on. And I don't know what that will be or what that will look like. Have you heard anything this week on the Buffalo drama? Yeah. Okay. So I'll talk. This is from Trish in Buffalo talking about the motion to dismiss. I said last week I was given the racketeering case against Peter Gerace Jr., 50-50 chance of getting tossed. I will add some insight here, and then I'll also have some stuff on the Patreon where I go deeper into it. So, yes, I do believe that we're still sitting at a 50-50 chance. In fact, I might go up to say 75-30 right now. Or sorry, 75, I can't count. 75-25 or 70-30 towards it getting tossed. And in fact, there has been some movement in relation to the obstruction case as well. The obstruction case related to the racketeering case where Crystal Quinn, the star witness, was killed via intentional overdose last summer. Was not on the stand when the first trial began in February, and was not on the stand when the second trial began last week, and will not be on the stand if there's a racketeering case against Gerace Jr. come October, like it's scheduled. There was a hearing related to that obstruction case where the judge seem to indicate that the obstruction case was weak, and that the judge, this is the judge saying, they don't know how much longer that obstruction case can stay active, and almost saying that, almost alluding to the fact that the judge believes that that case is on its way to being dismissed too. So right now, I know we have the Bongiovanni case going on as we speak, and I can talk a little bit about that. Joe Bongiovanni, the retired DEA agent, the reputed Buffalo mob mole who was protecting Buffalo mob drug operations, back on trial. First trial, convicted of lying and obstruction, and hung jury on the bribery charges, where he's accused of pocketing $250,000 and running interference for Buffalo mobsters. Right now, it looks to me that we're headed in a direction where both cases against Jerez Jr. are going to be thrown out. That's what my gut tells me. Now, I don't know how this Bongiovanni case is going to end. Even if it ends with a conviction of in the bribery, he's not looking at that much prison time. He's already out of the. He's already, he loses his pension, I'm sure, but he's been retired from the feds for 8 years now. But the big fish in this, Peter Jerez Jr., and then behind him, Tommy O, the boss of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. It was kind of a weak case to start, and I think that the belief from the feds was that between when they brought the case in January to now in August, I think they thought that they would have flipped somebody. Maybe they have, I don't know. But right now, it doesn't look like that case has gotten any stronger, and you have the robe on the bench saying that in open court. And then you have the motion to dismiss the racketeering case. So both of these cases, the racketeering, drug, sex trafficking case and the obstruction murder case, seem to be on a very, very tenuous ground right now. And you said, do I stand by 50-50? And I'm saying I'm going up to 75-25. They could bring the charges again in different forms. That's always possible. It depends in terms of if the judge dismisses with or without prejudice. But I would suspect there'd be a window there to come back with more charges in a different order. But right now, all the momentum is with the defense. And it seemed like the dam broke when everybody found out, and then my reporting was able to take the ball and run with it. The fact that there was this like pearl clutching from Judge Sinatra and the prosecutors last year, when Judge Sinatra had to recuse himself from the case, was replaced by Judge Villardo. And Judge Sinatra was not happy about having to leave the case, and he threw shade at the defense, saying that I think you with ill intent, manipulated witness list to get me off the case. And then when Judge Villardo took over, you had the prosecutors make a similar argument in open court that this was, chicanery on the behalf of the Jerez defense team. They were impugning defense attorneys. And it comes out this summer that there was more than ample evidence for Sinatra to have to recuse himself. And in fact, I question why he did not recuse himself from day one. I mean, he clearly, whether or not he was going to act on the impulse of having a conflict of interest, the fact is he had a conflict of interest. He thought, I guess, on its surface, he thought he could look past his conflict of interest. But way too many crossovers with Jerez Jr. and his uncle and his grandpa and Sinatra's family. Again, I'll keep saying Judge Sinatra is not a dirty judge. I've never heard him be accused of being a dirty judge. He is known as a straight shooter, but facts are facts, and he has these connections in his background and should have never been on that case to start with. And I question the logic behind him and the federal prosecutors last year throwing shade towards somebody for pointing something out that needed to be pointed out. And it seems like some of the karma from that, and I'm being a little hippy dippy here, but it just seems like since that came out, for a case that seemed to be riding all the momentum for the prosecution, it seems like the tide totally shifted, and now all the momentum is for the defense. This week, Bon Giovanni's trial was going on. More testimony. I'm going to do a breakdown on Patreon that you can probably get this weekend. But what I'll say, just to kind of tease that out, is there are more conflicts of interest that are coming up with Bon Giovanni that maybe we didn't know in the first trial, where it's clear that he was very compromised with a lot of alleged members and associates and affiliates and relatives of Buffalo OC from his days growing up in North Buffalo. And I will say that it seems that a lot of his, I've used this term a couple times today, a lot of his tradecraft in securing this protection or alleged protection for the mafia-backed drug rings was very calculated and in some ways subtle, and there was some nuance to it. But it seemed like he could identify guys that the local police were looking at and targeting, and then step in and tell the local police to go away, and then take over the situation and subvert. So that's interesting. And it seems like at least 2 times that were testified to this week where the state police handed off a CI to Bon Giovanni at Bon Giovanni's request at meetings. One of these meetings took place at the parking lot of a Buffalo hospital. And one of the guys that Bon Giovanni took possession of, for lack of a better term, was the one that ended up dead a couple months ago after he testified against Bon Giovanni and accused Bon Giovanni of outing him. And it looks like the prosecutors, it looks like the FBI is investigating his name is Bobby Kaiser, is investigating the Bobby Kaiser death with the same, or they're investigating the same possible MO as the Crystal Quinn death, that it was an intentional overdose. Or they're looking at the possibility that it was an intentional overdose. He was found, unlike Crystal Quinn, who was found dead on a couch, I believe, in a private residence. Bobby Kaiser was found face down on a jogging path. So, did he take some drugs and go jogging and then have a heart attack while he was jogging? Did he make a drug deal on the jogging path and get a bad batch? Was he killed somewhere else and dropped at the jogging path? These are all questions that shoot through my head. But we'll know more soon. I mean, the trial still goes on. Grew up with the Tocos in Harrison Township. Good friends with the Giacalonis. These people you speak of, Uncle Joe Toco, you have to admit they're great folks. Yeah, Uncle Joe Toco. I mean, I know a lot of the Giacalonis, a lot of the Tocos. Anybody that's met me in Detroit, people that I've covered, families that I've covered, I think anybody that's sat with me and met me face to face has come away with at least a more, if not a positive, I would say a more positive impression of me than they had before. I've always said, people come in all different sizes, shapes, and colors. Just nobody's one-dimensional. Everybody's multidimensional. There are people that are great human beings that do bad things. There are bad human beings that do great things, and most people are in that gray area. And I will say that the Toco family in general, Jack Toco and just kind of his immediate family, have always been very opposed to my presence, and I don't blame them. They have been more hurt with me, more, I would say less accessible to me than other people in the Detroit LCN orbit. So the Tocos that I've met have all been great. I know Joe Toco. If you're talking about Uncle, if Uncle Joe is Joe Toco, I can say that I know Joe Toco did not have the best impression of me at first. I don't really know what his impression of me now is, but I will say I know a lot of people that know Joe Toco, and everybody likes Joe Toco, and he's a guy that I know his one of his sons, and I love him. I love his one son. His one son, Paul, is a great guy, and is a great basketball coach, a great football coach, and I've gotten to know him from some of my side gigs, and that's Joe's son. I think it's his oldest boy. And again, I got nothing negative to say about those people. I would have loved to have met Jack Toco. I always would send word to him when he was alive, when I was around. We had about, let's say 7-8 years of when I was covering him when he was alive. Never had a desire to meet me, and I don't everybody, I'm not offended. I get it. But like I said, the Tocos not my biggest fans. Giacaloni's not. I'm not going to say they're my fans, but I have interacted with Jackie Giacaloni. He's always been cordial to me. I grew up around where he lived, and his kids all went to the public high school where I grew up. And my grandfather was part of Billy Giacaloni's kind of Jewish social circle. Billy was, the Italian mob capo that was in charge of all the Jewish bookies and Jewish loan sharks and Jewish drug dealers. And that was my grandfather's social circle, even though he was not a gangster himself. He was a big gambler, and he hung out with a lot of gamblers, guys that worked directly for Billy Giacaloni, and they would socialize a lot, 70s, 80s, 90s. And so my grandpa had great memories with Billy. I believe my dad and my grandpa used to golf with Tony Jack and Ronnie Morelli back in the day. So Giacalonis are just, the epitome of OG. So the Detroit people in general, I've all my interactions, with the exception of one, have been positive. The only negative interaction I had, and I won't name the person, I'll just say the family it comes from, but it came from the Lucido family. One of them showed up a book signing of mine and had a bit of a meltdown regarding stuff that I reported that was all fact. Jack Lucido got indicted for racketeering out of the Wolverine Golf Club, 26 Mile and Romeo Plank-ish, and got acquitted at trial, and then he died a couple months later. And so it's sad that had to be his, that was his last year of life. But and I know Jack Lucido's stepkids and good friends of mine, and great people. I love them, and I would have loved to have met Jack Lucido, but somebody that was related to him, I believe it was one of his children, or one of his nieces or nephews, did not like the fact that I was talking about Jack, and the fact that their grandchildren had to learn about their grandpa through some of my reporting or something. So that was my only real negative reaction in terms of face-to-face with the Detroit Italian group that I report on. Hell's Angels Show on Vice. Thank you. Best game documentary I've seen. Thank you. What did you think of the elder Canadian angel being arrested after doing the show? No, I don't think it was related. You're talking about a Sky Langlois. He was one of the OGs. I mean, he's one of the founding fathers of the Hells Angels in Canada. One of our producers, Michael, I have no idea how he did it, but he got Sky to participate in the documentary and got us into the, I think it was the South Chapter clubhouse, and was, I mean, that's like the coup of all coups when you're doing a Hells Angels doc. I mean, I obviously would have loved to have Marty Robert. I thought maybe we would have got it. I thought maybe we had a chance to get him, but it didn't happen. But yeah, it was great. And then he he got arrested in a raid, I think in April, or maybe it was, my timeline's getting messed up here, but he either since the show premiered or right before the show premiered, him and Sam Cassetta were both detained in a raid of Hells Angels clubhouses and were arrested. I'm not sure how Canadian law works. I haven't heard anything more about those charges. I know, when you get detained in America after a raid where they find stuff, most likely you ain't going home that day. But in a raid in Canada, it seems like they let you go, and then they either decide to charge you with what you got arrested for, or they don't. So he's, from what I understand, Skyline Wise is a free man right now, and has, the Crown has to decide whether or not those charges are going to stay. So I don't think it was related to the documentary. I could be mistaken, but I don't think it was. And I'm 100% sure none of that would have happened. None of the Sky's participation, access to the clubhouse, pictures, none of that would have happened without Marty Robert and Nurgat signing off on it. So I don't, there's no way he did that rogue. But thank you. I was very proud of that documentary. I hope we'll do a second season. Recent stuff on the Pernas. Big Joe Perna is the capo there now. He's running the Jersey faction of the Lucchese's. Something I want to put out here that someone pointed out in one of my comments, and they were right about. And again, I always want to set the record straight. Sometimes it gets confusing with the Pernas. A lot of names, sometimes the same name, but they're different people. In this case, we have two Joe Pernas, Little Joe Perna and Big Joe Perna. Big Joe Perna right now is the capo. Little Joe Perna is probably the one in more recent times that has had the more notorious reputation because of the fact, everybody likes the guy. He's somebody that's, very popular amongst a number of different crime families, and he's social, so he socializes with different crime families, and he's very close with Joey Merlino, who is, the most covered mafia boss of our time. The one that's the most, at this point, is just fully out in the public consumption sphere. So anyone, anytime that people start talking about Joey and people that Joey knows, Merlino, Little Joe Perna's name is going to come up. It's also interesting, just for a background on Little Joe Perna about how well liked this guy is. I don't remember the name of this woman, but right now she's one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. She's a studio boss, and this was Little Joe Perna's girlfriend for a period of time. So he has love and respect outside of the mob. This is one of the most successful, influential, powerful women in the entertainment industry. Sorry. And she was dating Joe Perna when Joe Perna, I think, was active. And there's wiretaps and stuff like that. She wasn't doing anything illegal or anything, but so a lot of people know Little Joe more than they know Big Joe. And I know that someone pointed out, and they were right. Again, I want to correct the record that in some of my reporting early on about the Pernas, I was saying that Little Joe was inducted in a ceremony in 2007, I think, in Toms River, that was observed by, maybe it was, I don't remember what year it was. It was the 03, 04, 07, one of those, somewhere in the 2000s. And it was a couple months after the Frankie Logano murder, and there was surveillance outside the house. I think it was state police, and it was Little Joe Perna's house. I reported incorrectly that Little Joe Perna got made at that ceremony. That's, from what I understand, not true. Big Joe Perna got made at that ceremony in 07. And I remember at the time talking to some people, and obviously I was mixing up which Joe Perna it was. But I remember talking to some people being like, I thought little Joe Perna had his button in the late 90s or early 2000s. I didn't think he would have to wait that long. So it looks like I was right about that. I just, in a couple of my articles and videos, I think I said that little Joe was made at that ceremony when it was Big Joe that was made at that ceremony. Big Joe, the captain, and then, you know, the Pernas are related to the Tusettas, and talking about things that are in the legal system right now, and the possibility that guys that are locked up will be coming out soon. I mean, I think Marty Tusetta will be home by Halloween. I mean, I think he's going to get out. Whether or not they want to try him again, you know, be out on bond, I don't know. But the judge, I think, is going to said it a week or two that she was going to make a ruling in a month. So I think we'll hear by the end of this month or early next month. But I think Marty Tussetta's to be coming home, and then you'll have pretty much all the Pernas back, and Mike and Marty Tussetta back. And then you got Georgie Neck running the whole show there. You know, he was running the New Jersey crew for a second, and now he's back in Brooklyn, and is said to be transitioning into the acting boss role, and Big Mike DeSantis will step into semi-retirement. So that's what I'm hearing about the Lucchese's in New Jersey and the Pernas. Thank you, Caparara Bakery. Thank you. So Scott, keep up the great work. My bulldog is for some reason having the zoomies right now and running around my kitchen. Scott, do you have any info on the David Auer murder from Detroit? I do. This is really nerdy, so I apologize if I start losing people with the Detroit mob minutia. David Auer was murdered in 1983, so it's been about 41 years. He was a mob associate and a neo-Nazi who was a collector of Hitler memorabilia and belonged to Nazi historical societies and stuff. And he shared an office space with Billy Giacalone and in an insurance company of some sort, I think. And Billy Giacalone and a guy named Bernie Schrott put a $1 million life insurance policy on David Auer through the business. And a year or two later, David Auer was found in the trunk of his Mercedes in the parking lot of a motel on Woodward Avenue, right when Bloomfield Hills becomes Pontiac, Bloomfield Hills is like the nicest city in Michigan. Bloomfield Hills and Grosse Pointe are the two wealthiest cities, and both of them border really bad areas. So in Grosse Pointe, you border East Detroit, or not East Detroit, but the east side of Detroit, and in Bloomfield Hills, you border Pontiac, which is not the best area. So David Auer was last seen with Bernie Schrott at a Bennigan's that I used to go to that Bennigan's at Square Lake and Woodward, had lunch, was seen leaving the Bennigan's with Bernie Schrott, and then I think 2 hours later, he was found about 2 miles north in the parking lot of the motel in the trunk of his car. And Bernie and Billy Jack recovered the $1 million life insurance policy. Bernie's Jewish. They call him Bernie the Jew. So I'm sure Bernie was not a big fan of David Auer, even if everything on the surface was copacetic. Like I said, David Auer was I don't know how open he was about it, but everyone I've spoken to about David Auer, one of the first things they say was yeah, he was a Nazi. So that's the David Auer story. And then Bernie, full transparency, I know Bernie, and Bernie was really good friends with my grandpa. Bernie is a suspect in that murder, and then 10 years later in the early 1990s, he's the suspect. He's a suspect in the murder of Theodis Ship, who was a black drug dealer that was doing coke deals with the Jackalonis, who cut a cooperation deal on a Thursday with the FBI, was put into a protection unit at the top of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in a penthouse, I believe Friday, and then on Saturday night he was killed when there was a lapse of time on the door guarding Ship and his wife and newborn child. And the wife was a woman named Lydia Mallet, whose brother was Conrad Mallet, who was the Supreme Court Justice in the state of Michigan, the head Supreme Court Justice in the state of Michigan. Theodis Ship was a guy that coined the term the gangster of love. He was a guy that was known for dating very rich and powerful women, as well as being a player in the underworld. Before he married Lydia Mallet, he was married to Wendy Baxter, who's a judge. And Theodis Ship, they called him Yellow Man, was also a major cocaine and heroin trafficker. And it looks like somebody got a tip off, and somebody knew there was going to be 10 minutes or 15 minutes when nobody was guarding the door, and they busted in there with ski masks, and they killed Theodis Ship. They tied up Lydia Mallet and her baby. They stole some type of Gucci bag from Ship that he'd been carrying around for for like a week, like not wanting to give it up. No one knew exactly sure what was in there. And then the alleged killer, a guy by the name of Brandon Leatherwood, 2 months later is found in the trunk of his car at I don't know if it was the Detroit airport or the Indianapolis airport. He was either at the Detroit airport, supposed to go back to Indianapolis, or he was in Indianapolis, supposed to come back to Detroit. They found him in the trunk of his car. So they killed Theodis and then killed the person that killed Theodis. And Bernie Sherratt was involved in that case. And him and the Jackalonis are considered suspects in that homicide. So I was around a lot of colorful characters when I was growing up. Hey, Scott, thank you for donating the podcast. How strong of a presence does the Sicilian Mafia in the U.S.? Do you think they can help rebuild the U.S. Mafia? I think in certain parts of the United States right now, specifically the Genovese crime family, the Gambino crime family in New York City, the outfit in Chicago, and here in Detroit, you have a Sicilian influence that is, as strong as it's ever been. With the Gambinos, they're in this whole Sicilian era for the last 15 years, and their family is running incredibly well with Lorenzo Menino and Dom Cefalo and those guys. In Chicago, it's a little bit quieter, and I think you're going to be seeing some Sicilians emerge in the next decade or so as leaders in that family to kind of help move that family forward, along with the younger Cicero guys. When I say younger, I mean this group of guys that I know were mentored by Mikey Sarno, Fat Mike Sarno, and there's probably about 30 of them that are between the ages of say 45 and 65 right now. And then in Detroit, we got the Dana brothers, and they control most of the east side of Detroit in terms of rackets, and they're serious people. They allegedly could have buttons on both sides of the Atlantic. Their uncle is allegedly the godfather of Terracini, where all of the most of the Detroit mob, majority of the Detroit mob, trace their lineage to Terracini in Palermo. And I think Detroit and Chicago are becoming more narcotic influenced than they have in the past. And I think the future of both of those groups might look more like, I think I said this on the last live, might look more like a narcotics organization that does racketeering than a racketeering organization that dabbles in narcotics. And then Chicago, you also have this, like what I've termed the street gangification of the outfit, where a lot of these Cicero guys that Mike Sarno mentored came from a street gang background, 12th Street Players, and have more of that type of mentality than just a straight racketeer or mobster. They have a street corner gangster element to them. Scott, I was one of the Pontiac officers at the scene at the Sheridan where ours was discovered. I always want to know about that case. All right, so Paul was there when they found him in the trunk of the car. Yeah, I've never asked Bernie about it. I'm sure he knows that I know about it. If he's watching this, Bernie, I know about it. But I've never really asked him about it. From a personal point of view, and I don't think anyone deserves to be murdered, or I'm not pro homicide. I'm probably a little bit more triggered in the, since October with the anti-Semitism in this country. So that might be coloring some of my opinion. But when I hear about what David Auer was all about, and I know David Auer, I'm sure, had wife and kids and mother and father, and nobody deserves that, the ripple effects. But from what I understand, this guy was like a wannabe Nazi. So him getting put in the trunk of his car, and my grandpa's buddy and Billy Giacalone collecting $1 million for it. I don't judge that the way I would judge 99% of other mob murders. I don't know what that says about me. I'm biased. Matt Clark here, deep dive here. I was in Detroit visiting my father when I was 12, 1993. I went to an Italian restaurant where the owner said hi to him and my dad. Said hi to who? Told me he was LCN. A few years later, he died. Big funeral. Looks like Don Cheech. I have no idea who this was. 93. Well, Jack Lucido died he wouldn't have owned a restaurant. Jack Lucido died in 95. Detroit mobster in the early 90s that went to I don't know. I can't, I think there's a lot of people that present I've used that word a couple times, present as mafiosi and are adjacent to mafiosi, but aren't actual mafiosi. Because I'm going to tell you this right now, most people that would say that they're an owner of an Italian restaurant aren't mob guys. They're guys that have mob guys behind them, because most mob guys that own restaurants, they have like silent ownership stakes in them. The restaurants that had mob influence, Larco's, Lely's, Mario's, Luciano's, but none of those guys had owners that died at that point. So I guess I would need, if you give me a last name, I could probably help you out. But 1993 was the first time I ever knowingly laid eyes on a mob boss. I remember Christmas 93. I was with my grandpa. And this also shows you something, that my grandpa was a guy that used to run around with the Billy Jack. But if you don't know, you don't know. And I remember my grandpa pointing out Tony Tocco to me. And at that time, Tony Tocco was just a captain. He wasn't even in the admin at that point. Eventually, he became consigliere and acting boss. But I remember my grandpa pointing him out to me and introducing him to me and saying, no. And when we left, he said, that's the mafia boss of Detroit. And my grandpa was mistaken. His brother, Jack Tocco, was the mafia boss of Detroit. But to my grandpa, like Jack and Tony Tocco were either the same person or he got them confused. But I always remember December 93, where I was. That was my first time my grandpa like kind of filled me in on who some of the people that he was hanging out with. And that was December 1993. I was 16. Gus, thank you, Gus Valtusaras. Sorry, I just butchered your name, Gus. Scott, what are your thoughts on the Ndregata in Canada? Yeah, I mean, with the Ndregata, you got to go to more to Toronto than Montreal, but they control pretty much all LCN in Ontario. They're transnational. They got guys here, guys everywhere. Toronto's fascinating me. I don't claim to be an expert on Toronto OC. Maybe one day I'll deep dive that stuff. I'm just now kind of becoming an expert on the Rizzutos, but I'm still learning more every day. But the real organizations that have roots in the home, in the motherland, those are the things. Those are juggernauts. So those people talk about the mafia families in America. It started off as 26 of them, and now we're down to probably a dozen. And it's only the attrition's going to only keep going in one direction, which is downward. But with Ndregata and Camorra, and you're talking 150 years, 200 years, they're never going to go away. Bubba Matt 812, thank you. Hello, sir. I'm from Southwest Indiana. I was wondering if there's any prominent OC history. Yes, Southwest Indiana. I think you're going to have more in terms of, the Evansville. I went to college in Indiana. I consider Indiana like a second home to me. I love the state of Indiana. Like I feel when I go across the border, there's something like I get like a jolt in my veins of Hoosierdom. Some of the best years of my life were spent in Bloomington, Indiana, which is in, kind of South Central Indiana or Central Indiana. Love it. Just love the vibe there. Love the people. In terms of organized crime in Indiana, you really only had, in terms of traditional OC, you only had Indianapolis, which for a long time was I don't even want to say satellite because that's kind of giving it too much credit. It was like a quasi satellite of Chicago. One of Giancana's guys, Frankie Formosa, was the de facto Italian mafia, the de facto Italian mafia boss of Indianapolis in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And Northwest Indiana by Chicago, all those kind of factory towns, had always been controlled by the outfit, and the Detroit mob Detroit mob would sometimes have a piece of it. When you're going down south by Kentucky, I don't think you would have ever had traditional Italian OC, but for lack of a better term, I mean, cornbread mafia, Dixie mafia, which was a lot less organized, but believe me, they were everywhere. It's another kind of area I wouldn't mind learning more about, so I could share, bringing some experts on to talk about. But throughout all of those rural southern towns, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all those towns had some Dixie Mafia presence. Now, again, that it sounds more organized than it is. Like the Dixie Mafia is more of a general term. There wasn't really any type of organization. There were all these kind of mini fiefdoms that kind of would allow people to paint a broad brush as cornbread mafia or Dixie Mafia, but in reality they had no connection to each other. So the guys that were running around Georgia doing their rackets had nothing to do with the guys in Mississippi, and the guys in Mississippi had nothing to do with the guys in Tennessee, and so forth. But believe me, there was organized crime going on by these country boys, hillbillies. But and in some cases they would work with an LCN type group for other things on kind of the other side of it. But I don't think that was normal, but it did exist. So I would say, I'd be almost certain that it, if you go back and you do some research into Southern Indiana crime, right, from Pike County, and you would, well, and I also know in Evansville, you said Evansville, I know that there was a famous mob murder in Evansville in the 70s. I want to say the guy's name was Ray Ryan, and he was a Chicago Mafia associate that was doing stuff for them in Evansville. And I think they blew him up in a car. So there's some OC right there in Evansville, right in your hometown. Like real OC, like Tony Spilatro, Tony Accardo OC. Now we'll go for another about 10 minutes, and then we'll shut it down, and we'll jump back maybe next Monday. We'll jump back on Monday and start rocking and rolling some of these again. How many capos does Detroit have? You mean right at this very second, or historically at one point I think they had like 12 capos when they were at their peak. And then Detroit also has crew bosses, which is, you don't necessarily even have to be Italian. You can be a crew boss. Right now, I would say Detroit probably has 3 or 4 capos. Crew boss and a capo. Well, so Chicago and Detroit both have what I would call crew bosses that aren't necessarily capos. And that just means that you have a group of subordinates that are underneath you, anywhere between, let's say, 5 and 15 or 5 and 25. And you, without being a official mob administrator, you are tapped to be that crew boss. Now you're going to report to a mob administrator, but the mob administrator is going to give you autonomy to oversee that crew as long as everything's on the up and up. So in Detroit, you had a place called, or a group, and I think I talked about this on the last live, the Capitol Street Social Club, which was known as the Capitol Street Social Club crew, which was run by a Jew and an Arab, Freddie the Saint Salem and Alan the General Health. They ran that group, and there were no Italians, pretty much. It was all Jewish, Middle Eastern, Polish, and then they would report to the Giacalones. In Chicago, you had, just off the top of my head, in the north side of Chicago for decades and decades at Rogers Park, Lenny Patrick could never be made into the mafia. He was Jewish, but he was as respected as any gangster was. He had a lot of bodies from back in the 30s and 40s. And, by the 70s and 80s, he was allowed to do his own thing. He controlled all of Rogers Park, controlled, the whole north side with all those Jewish bookies, a lot of money. But he was never officially a capo. He was a crew boss that reported to a capo who reported to the admin. So just another way to layer things, buffers, for lack of a better term, from the Godfather. Phil, sorry, are you familiar with any significant Cosa Nostra activity in Trenton? Yeah, Trenton is, I will say that every city in New Jersey has had mob activity to some degree. You just said Trenton, and I'll just throw this out there now. This isn't Italian Mafia, but it's just coming out in the last 48 hours. NewJersey.com reported it. I reported it on a Gangster Report that the Hells Angels boss of Trenton got into a fight with the Pagans back in February at a place called Nottingham Tavern in Hamilton, New Jersey, and was beaten severely. And his name was Boyd Pulker. And Pulker refused to press charges, wouldn't give a statement, wouldn't talk to the feds. And then like 24 hours later, there was an incident at the Tropicana Hotel and Casino in Atlantic City where 2 Pagans were jumped by Hells Angels. So that's some activity going on in Trenton right now. I know it's not Italian, but it's happened this year in 2024. Scott, what is your opinion of the Calabrese brothers saying that Tony Accardo killed Giancana? Okay, so I've heard this, and For people that might not know, the Calabrese, Kurt and Frankie Jr. have said that they heard from I think they heard from their father or somebody else that would have known that Tony Accardo himself killed Sam Giancana in 75. We know that whoever killed Giancana was close to him because Giancana let this person in. Giancana was cooking a meal for this person. And it, according to the crime scene analysis, Sam Giancana was standing over a stove cooking sausage and peppers, and his murderer came up behind him and put two in the back of his head. Since it happened, a lot of people point the finger at Butch Blassie, who was his longtime bodyguard. A lot of other people point the finger at Tony Spilatro, who was a protege of his that was living in Vegas doing what we saw in the movie Casino, but would come back to Chicago to do a hit if he needed to, and Giancana would let him in. I don't dismiss the Tony Accardo thing. I'm not going to say it happened. I'm not going to confirm it, but I don't think that's as crazy as it sounds. I know when the first impulse is that sounds nuts. Why would a 70-year-old Tony Accardo do that? But in some ways, it might make sense if someone like Accardo was willing to do that. So I definitely don't dismiss it. I would say it's possible, and I'd even right now put Accardo into my, if I was going to do a ranking of top 5 people, the likelihood that they were the trigger man on Sam Giancana, I would definitely put Accardo in there now. So I give that some credence. Scott, do you think Gabe Bergoglio had anything to do with Hoffa's disappearance? This is from Francesco. He was one of he's the last suspect alive. He is the last suspect. He's not one of the last suspects. He was one of the suspects, and he's the last one alive today. I think he knows something, but when I say I think he knows something, I think he knows crumbs, bits and pieces from his brother. I don't think he was there. I don't think he has any information that would solve the case. I think the entire New Jersey Provenzano crew, in my opinion, is the most overrated part, overanalyzed, and some place that everybody wants to go to because of the narrative, which is it was an accurate narrative that Tony Pro and Jimmy Hoffa hated each other at the end. They had once been close friends, and that they both wanted to kill each other. There was no secret. They had been threatening to kill each other for, at that point, 7-8 years. So it's an easy narrative, just like the Chucky O'Brien having the car is an easy narrative. And I think it's intentional. They want the Giacalones who put this whole murder conspiracy together. They wanted people looking at the Bergoglios and looking at Tony Pro and looking at the Andretta brothers and looking at Chucky O'Brien. It's all by design. So I think if the New Jersey guys had anything to do with it, they weren't frontline players. They were brought in to be part of the theatrics. That if Sally Buggs was in the car, he was in the car because the Giacalones knew that Hoffa would be convinced that Tony Pro was nearby if he saw Sally Buggs there. Which is the opposite with Chucky O'Brien. If Hoffa was met in the parking lot of the Red Fox with Chucky O'Brien behind the wheel of a car, he would have never got in. And again, it's something that was like an easy narrative, like, oh, Chucky and Hoffa were, father and son, and Chucky was his adopted son, and he looked at Hoffa as a surrogate dad, and well, again, all true. But the last year, they were not on speaking terms. They got into a huge fight. Thanksgiving 1974, they were not talking to each other. Chucky O'Brien was running around telling everyone that Jimmy Hoffa was an FBI confidential informant. So everything you wanted to do that afternoon was to lower Jimmy Hoffa's guard and lower the temperature and make him feel comfortable and unagitated. If Chucky O'Brien was in the car, in the driver's seat, all that would have done would do the opposite. Hoffa would have gotten agitated and started hollering at Chucky O'Brien, and I doubt he would have gotten in the car. So I'm answering your question the long way. I do not think Gabe Bergoglio has any real substantive knowledge. I think he probably knows a specific here or there that he caught in the time, in the days, weeks, months, years after. But I don't think the Detroit guys needed any of the Provenzano crew to come in and do their house cleaning, which is effectively what the narrative is. The Detroit guys were not able to handle their own business, and they needed the big bad New York mobsters or New Jersey mobsters to come in and put the big boy pants on and do the big boy work, which is just so insulting and just also just screams that you don't know what the hell you're talking about. The Detroit Mafia, I always say they had a PhD in gangland murder. Nobody in the Detroit mob has ever been convicted of a murder, a mob murder. And there's been 100 years of them, and there's probably been 100 of them. In every other city, there have been numerous mobsters from those cities convicted of mob-related homicide. So Detroit knew how to do it. They knew how to do it the best way. They did it. It was the perfect murder. We're sitting here still talking about it. So that was a long answer to your question. Well, I enjoyed this, guys. Please keep them coming. We'll keep on rolling these out. I'll try to do 2 a week from now on, and we're going to keep on filling up the YouTube channel, and you'll be able to get YouTube fix. Patreon, we're going to be putting more stuff out. I want to have 2 or 3 things every week at least, if not more, including exclusive interviews. And then, check Gangster Report every day. We got new content up. Please like, subscribe, share. Thanks for Benny Behind the Glass. Maybe we'll get Jimmy to come in on some of these lives at one point. And we can just knock it around with me, him, and the rest of you guys. So I appreciate it. Hope everybody has a great weekend. Scott Burnstein, OG Pod Live, out.